By October 1943, the Soviet Union had lost around 8 million soldiers. 8 million. The number is so large that the human brain cannot process it as individual tragedy. It can only process it as statistics. But this story does not begin with a statistic. It begins with a woman sitting in front of a typewriter in Omsk, 4,000 kilometers from the front, drafting a letter to the State Defense Committee of the Soviet Union. The letter is 2 pages long. It is written with a precision no official expected from a 45-year-old widow. She does not ask for condolences. She does not ask for a pension. She asks for a tank, and she asks to be allowed to drive it herself. The name of that woman is Maria Vasilyevna Oktyabrskaya, and what she did after sending that letter silently and permanently reorganized what the Soviet army believed was possible within its own ranks. First, the world she was living in when she wrote that letter. In the summer of 1941, Operation Barbarossa unleashed upon Soviet territory the largest land invasion in recorded history. 3 million German soldiers crossed the border along a front 2,900 kilometers long. The first days were an unprecedented catastrophe for the Red Army. In the first 72 hours, the Luftwaffe destroyed more than 1,200 Soviet aircraft, most of them still on the ground. Entire divisions were encircled and annihilated or captured before they could reorganize. Minsk fell in 6 days, Smolensk in 2 months. By December 1941, the Germans had captured more than 3 million Soviet prisoners of war. Of those 3 million, approximately 2 million died in captivity before the year was over, not from battle. From hunger, exposure, and systematic execution, Maria Oktyabrskaya knew all this. She knew it because her husband, political commissar Ilya Oktyabrski, was at that front. He had been assigned to the West in the first days of the invasion. Letters arrived less and less frequently as the year went on. Then they stopped arriving. In August 1941, Maria received the official notification. Ilya Oktyabrski had died in combat. There is no record of how long it took her to decide what she was going to do next. What there is a record of is what she did. She sold all her belongings. Clothes, furniture, jewelry, whatever, had survived from an entire life. She gathered 50,000 rubles. In 1943, 50,000 rubles was the approximate cost of manufacturing a standard production T-34 tank. That was not a coincidence. Maria had done the math. She donated the money to the Soviet state with one explicit condition. She wanted the tank to bear the name WWII Podruga, which in Russian means fighting girlfriend, and she wanted to be the one to crew it in battle. The letter reached Stalin. There are versions that say Stalin read it personally. What is documented is that the answer was yes. The Soviet state accepted the donation, accepted the name painted on the tank's hull, and accepted the condition. Maria Oktyabrskaya would be trained as a tank driver and assigned to an active combat unit at the front. She was 44 years old. To understand why this was an anomaly the Soviet military system could barely process, you have to understand how tank crew training worked in 1943. The standard program lasted between 6 months and a year for operators with previous mechanical experience. It covered vehicle operation, field maintenance, armored unit tactics, communications under fire, and emergency repair. It was physically exhausting. T-34 tanks had no hydraulic assistance in the controls. Shifting gears required brute strength. Maneuvering under fire demanded constant coordination between driver, gunner, and commander in a space where the interior temperature could exceed 50 degrees. Maria completed the training. There are no records of her individual evaluations during the training period. What there is the fact that at the end of the process, she was certified as a combat tank driver and assigned to the Guards Tank Regiment operating on the Smolensk front, part of the 2nd Guards Armored Corps. She reached the front in October 1943. The regiment was a veteran unit. It had taken part in the Battle of Kursk 3 months earlier, the largest clash of armored forces in military history. At Kursk, the Soviet Army had deployed more than 5,000 tanks along a front 250 kilometers long. Soviet losses in armored vehicles during that battle exceeded 6,000. The regiment that received Maria had come out of Kursk decimated and reorganized. The men who remained had seen things they could not find direct words to describe. The first documented reaction of her fellow soldiers to Maria's arrival varies depending on the source. Some testimonies speak of open skepticism, others of calculated indifference. What all the sources agree on is that no one expected her to last very long at the front. On October 21st, 1943, the regiment received orders to attack German positions near the village of Novoye Selo in the Smolensk region. It was an infantry support operation. The tanks were to break through German defensive lines to allow the foot forces to advance. Maria Oktyabrskaya entered combat for the first time that day. During the assault, her tank was hit, damaging one of the running systems. Under those circumstances, the standard procedure was to withdraw to a safe position and wait for technical assistance. Maria stopped the tank, got out of the vehicle under German infantry fire, repaired the damage with field tools, went back inside, and continued the attack. Her fellow soldiers saw it. No one had asked for it. No one expected it. The regiment commander, Colonel Novikov, recorded the incident in his combat report. It was the first entry with her name in the Soviet military files. If you still are not subscribed to the channel, this is the moment. What comes next in this story is heavier than what you have just heard. The following months solidified something the regiment had not anticipated. Maria Oktyabrskaya was not a propaganda anomaly. She was a functional tank driver under real combat conditions, with a specific ability that few of her comrades could match. She could repair her own vehicle under fire with a speed and precision that reduced combat downtime in a measurable way. That skill did not come from any special military training. It came from years of life alongside an army officer, during which Maria had learned basic mechanics out of curiosity and necessity. Ilya Oktyabrski had had access to military vehicles for years. Maria had spent that time watching, asking, learning, not as preparation for any war. The war turned that curiosity into a direct tactical advantage. On November 18, 1943, during operations near the village of Krinky, Maria's tank was hit again. This time, the damage was more severe, a track shredded by German anti-tank artillery fire. She got out again, repaired it under fire. Returned to combat. Colonel Novikov submitted a formal recommendation for a decoration. The Red Army of 1943 had a complex relationship with women in combat roles. Official policy allowed it. Doctrine endorsed it in cases of extreme necessity, and the Soviet Union had been in a permanent state of extreme necessity since 1941. But the internal culture of combat units, especially armored ones, operated with its own logic that official policy did not always penetrate. What changed that culture in the regiment was no decree. It was Maria's repeated behavior in situations where other drivers would have waited for assistance. The men who had arrived skeptical began to record what they saw, not in documents, in conversations. In letters to their families that survived in private archives decades later. One of those letters, written by a tank crewman from the regiment, whose name the archives record only as V. Gromov, says the following: "There is a woman in our unit who repairs her tank while the Germans are shooting at her. None of us argues about it anymore." By December 1943, Maria had taken part in multiple combat operations along the Smolensk front. The regiment records document at least 4 instances of field repair under active enemy fire. Each of those instances was recorded because it was unusual enough to deserve notation in the operational reports. The front on which the regiment was operating during that period was part of the general Soviet operation to recover the territory lost in 1941 and 1942. Smolensk had fallen into German hands in September 1941 after 2 months of combat that cost the Red Army around 300,000 dead and more than 600,000 captured. The city had been retaken on September 25, 1943, only weeks before Maria arrived at the front. The fighting in the region had not ended. The territory west of Smolensk remained an active operations zone where the Germans held defensive lines prepared during 2 years of occupation. Those lines included minefields, buried anti-tank artillery positions, and trench networks designed specifically to stop Soviet armored advances. The T-34 Maria drove was a formidable vehicle by 1943 standards, but it was not invulnerable. German PaK-40 anti-tank guns could penetrate its frontal armor at distances of up to 800 meters under normal conditions. At shorter distances, the result was almost always the same. Soviet tank crewmen of that period had a life expectancy in active combat that the military manuals themselves did not clearly document, because doing so would have been devastating for morale. Later estimates, based on casualty records, suggest that a Soviet tank crewman on the Eastern Front in 1943 had a statistical probability of surviving 6 months of continuous combat of less than 30%. Maria Oktyabrskaya knew that or sensed it. There is no documentation that she discussed it with anyone. What is documented is what she did on January 17, 1944. That day, during an assault on German positions near the village of Shvedi, in the Vitebsk region, the tank Boevaya Podruga was hit by German anti-tank artillery, destroying part of the steering mechanism and severely damaging the left track. The tank was immobilized in open ground, less than 200 meters from the German positions. Maria got out. What happened in the following minutes is reconstructed from testimonies by Soviet soldiers who observed the action from nearby positions and from the combat. Report of the officer commanding the operation that day. Maria got out of the tank with her tools. She began the repair. German fire continued in the area. A shrapnel shell struck near the tank. Maria Oktyabrskaya received a grave head wound. She did not die at that moment. She was evacuated to the nearest field hospital, then transferred to a military hospital in Smolensk. The doctors documented a severe cranial injury. Maria Oktyabrskaya remained unconscious or semi-conscious for weeks. The hospital medical records indicate that there were brief periods of lucidity in which she recognized people around her, but she could not communicate clearly. On March 2, 1944, Maria Vasilyevna Oktyabrskaya died in the military hospital in Smolensk. She was 45 years old. Write in the comments whether you knew this woman existed. Most people arrive at this video having never heard her name. What happened after her death followed a trajectory. The Soviet system applied selectively to its female combat figures. Official recognition, ceremony, and then a gradual silence that was not planned oblivion, but simply the inertia of a bureaucratic machinery that did not know exactly what to do with her in peacetime. On August 16, 1944, 5 months after her death, the Soviet government awarded Maria Oktyabrskaya the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest decoration of the Soviet state. The order was signed posthumously. With it came the Order of Lenin and the Gold Star Medal. The official resolution accompanying the decoration described her actions in precise military terms: participation in multiple combat operations, field repairs under enemy fire, conduct on the battlefield consistent with the highest standards of the Red Army. It did not mention that she was a woman explicitly in the tactical justification. That mention appeared only in the attached biographical data. That detail is not minor. It reveals something about how the system processed what she had done, as a military fact first, and as a gender fact afterward. In that specific order, the tank WWII Podruga remained in service after Maria's death. The regiment records indicate that it was assigned to another driver and continued operating at the front until accumulated damage put it out of service at some point in 1944. There is no precise documentation of the exact moment the tank stopped being used. The name painted on its hull, WWII Podruga, was still visible in the last photographs that survived in the regiment archives. The photographs of Maria, inside or beside the tank that circulated during the war, were produced in part as propaganda material by the Soviet information apparatus. This does not mean that the actions they documented were fabricated. It means that the Soviet system understood from the beginning the communicative value of what Maria represented and used it actively. The photographs reached Soviet military publications, party newspapers, and eventually Allied international media that covered the Soviet war effort. In the United States, Life magazine published a brief note about Maria Oktyabrskaya in 1944. It was one of several profiles of Soviet women in combat roles that the Allied press covered during that period as part of the general coverage of the Eastern Front. The note in Life described her in terms that reflected both genuine admiration and the cultural perplexity of a North American audience that had no frame of reference for processing what it was reading. This kind of story is the one we keep telling on this channel. If you are not subscribed yet, you are missing this every week. The story of Maria Oktyabrskaya within the Soviet Union followed a specific path in the decades that followed. During the years immediately after the war, her name appeared on lists of heroes of the Great Patriotic War, which is how the Soviet Union officially referred to the conflict with Germany. There was a street named after her in Omsk. There were references in historical military publications, but the depth of her story, the details of her specific operations, the exact mechanics of what she did on the battlefield, that information was spread across military archives, to which public access was limited during the Soviet era. Researchers who wanted to work with Red Army documents from the Second World War depended on what the state chose to declassify, and the state declassified selectively and slowly. What this means in practical terms is that the full story of Maria Oktyabrskaya, with the level of detail contained in the military archives, was not significantly available to outside researchers until after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Russian archives that opened in the 1990s revealed dimensions of her story that the official Soviet version had simplified or directly omitted. One of those dimensions is the internal resistance she faced within the system. Before her request was approved, the letter Maria sent to the State Defense Committee was not processed immediately. The archives reveal that it passed through at least 2 levels of bureaucratic review, where intermediate officials expressed doubts about the advisability of approving the request. The arguments documented in those internal reviews did not question the financial donation, which was welcome. They questioned the condition that Maria drive the tank herself. The arguments were framed in operational terms. A 44-year-old woman with no prior military experience represented a risk to the vehicle and to the unit to which she would be assigned. It was an argument that made sense within its own parameters. It was also an argument that ignored the fact that in 1943, the Red Army was sending 16-year-old boys and 60-year-old men to the front with minimal training because there were not enough bodies available. The final approval came from higher levels, bypassing the intermediate filters. That pattern, a decision taken from above, short-circuiting the middle bureaucracy, was characteristic of the Soviet system when political will was clear. And in Maria Oktyabrskaya's case, the political will was clear from the moment the letter reached Stalin. Why Stalin approved the request is a question the archives answer indirectly. The Soviet Union in 1943 needed narratives of total resistance. It needed to demonstrate, inward and outward, that the war effort was a genuine mobilization of the whole Soviet society. A widow who sells everything she has to buy a tank and asks to go fight in it is exactly the kind of story that narrative apparatus needed. That does not make Maria's story any less real. It makes it more complex. It was simultaneously a genuine personal act born from the loss of her husband, and a narrative the Soviet state absorbed and amplified for its own purposes. Both things coexisted. The Soviet system was very skilled at identifying those genuine stories and turning them into tools of communication without necessarily falsifying the central facts. What the Soviet propaganda apparatus did with Maria's story was emphasize certain elements and silence others. It emphasized the donation, the tank's name, the bravery in combat. It silenced the initial bureaucratic doubts, the internal resistance to the approval process, and certain aspects of her real conditions at the front that did not fit the image they wanted to project. One of those silenced aspects has to do with the treatment she received within the regiment in the first months. Official Soviet sources present a relatively smooth integration. Maria arrives, proves her worth, is accepted. The private testimonies that came to light after 1991 present a more granular picture. There were periods of social isolation within the unit. There were documented comments by intermediate officers who questioned her presence in ways the formal reports did not record. There were moments when the distance between Maria and the rest of her tank crew was palpable. What those same testimonies also document is that that distance closed progressively, and that the mechanism by which it closed was exclusively her behavior in combat, not an order, not a political intervention. Repeated behavior under real fire. The men who had arrived skeptical changed their position because they saw things they could not ignore. That process has its own historical weight, separate from any official narrative. The state of the archives on Maria Oktyabrskaya in Russia today is fragmentary. Military documents from the period are distributed between the Russian State Military Archive in Moscow, regional archives in Omsk where she lived before the war, and private collections that emerged after the openings of the 1990s. No researcher has been able to compile a complete picture because the archives have never been fully accessible all at once. What that means in practical terms is that there are aspects of Maria Oktyabrskaya's story that are probably documented in those archives and that still have not been published in any history book, any documentary, or any publicly available academic article. Her full story has not yet been told. What has been told, what the available archives allow to be reconstructed with certainty, is dense enough that it is worth pausing on some specific points that the standard narrative tends to overlook. The first has to do with the exact nature of her wound on January 17, 1944. The medical reports that survived in the archives of the military hospital in Smolensk describe a skull fracture with associated brain damage caused by shrapnel. The shrapnel was the result of an artillery shell that did not hit Maria directly, but detonated in the ground near the tank. The difference matters because it illustrates the exact mechanics of the risk she was taking every time she got out of the vehicle to repair it. The T-34's armor protected her while she was inside. The moment she got out, her protection was zero. She had gone out under those conditions at least 4 documented times before January 17th, probably more times that were not left in the formal reports. The second point has to do with the tank itself after her death. There is a tendency in the popular narrative of Maria's story to present the WWII Podruga almost as if it were an extension of her, an object with permanent symbolic meaning. The reality, documented by the regiment archives, is more prosaic. It was a military vehicle in an active war zone. It was assigned to another driver. It continued to be used until operational damage rendered it unusable, and at some point it ceased to exist as a functional physical object. There is no record that it was preserved. There is no museum exhibiting it. The tank Maria bought with the proceeds of selling everything she had probably ended up scrapped in some repair shop on the Eastern Front or abandoned in a field when the damage exceeded the available repair capacity. That end of the fives. Tank does not appear in any popular version of Maria Oktyabrskaya's story. The third point has to do with the money. 50,000 rubles in 1943 was an amount that a woman in Maria's position could not have, accumulated in an ordinary way. Salaries in the Soviet Union at that time were low. The material goods that could be sold for that amount implied years of accumulation and household economy. The available records do not detail exactly what she sold or at what prices. What the amount suggests is that Maria had lived with considerable frugality during her years married to an army officer, accumulating goods that, in the wartime context of 1,942 and 1,943, had high market value because material goods were scarce. There is something in that detail that does not usually appear in the popular versions of the story. Maria's donation was not an impulsive gesture. It was the result of a whole life of household economy, converted into a single, deliberate act at the moment she lost the reason for which she had built that life. In Omsk, where she lived before the war, there is a street that has borne her name since the Soviet era. There is a commemorative plaque. In some years, groups of veterans or their descendants would lay flowers on the date of her death. In Smolensk, where she died, the military hospital where she spent her last weeks does not exist in the same form it did in 1944. The city was almost completely destroyed during the war and rebuilt afterward. The physical geography where the last chapters of her story happened has changed in a way that makes it difficult to anchor memory to a specific place. Her grave is in Smolensk. The record of exactly where has survived in the city archives. It is not a prominent monument. It is a grave in a cemetery where thousands of Soviet soldiers who fell in the region during the war are also buried. In that context, it does not stand out. It is part of a mass of deaths that the physical landscape of Smolensk still carries in ways visitors who do not know the city's history do not always perceive. If you made it this far in this video, you already know more about Maria Oktyabrskaya than 99% of people in the world. Share the video. There are people around you who need to hear this story. What the documents from the German side recorded about Maria Oktyabrskaya is scarce. The German Eastern Front archives for that period and that specific geographic zone that survived the war and were accessible to researchers contain no nominal references to her. This is not surprising. The German forces in that sector of the front in the autumn and winter of 1943 were facing generalized Soviet pressure along a front hundreds of kilometers long, and German intelligence reports tended to focus on units, not individuals, except in cases where a specific individual had generated enough operational impact to be identified as a target. Maria Oktyabrskaya operated as part of a unit in operations that, from the German perspective, were Soviet armored assaults of a magnitude that made it difficult to distinguish individual performance within the whole. What the German records do document in detail is the type of terrain and the defensive conditions in the zone where she operated. That documentation allows the exact conditions she faced every time she got out of the tank to repair it to be reconstructed with some precision. The German positions in that region of the front, in the autumn and winter of 1943, had been built and reinforced over more than 2 years of occupation. German military engineers had taken advantage of the terrain with precision, cleared lines of fire, minefields in depth, anti-tank artillery positions with angles of coverage calculated to maximize damage against advancing Soviet T-34s. The Red Army officers, planning the assaults in which Maria took part, knew they were sending their tanks against defenses prepared with time and experience. That context gives each field repair Maria carried out an additional dimension. She was not repairing a tank in an environment of generic risk. She was repairing a tank in an environment of calculated risk, designed specifically to destroy tanks and kill the people crewing them. There is one element of Maria Oktyabrskaya's story that the most recent historical analyses have begun to examine more carefully: the relationship between her individual story and the broader phenomenon of Soviet women in combat roles during the Second World War. The Soviet Union mobilized between 800,000 and 1 million women at the front during the conflict. Of that total, approximately 200,000 carried weapons in direct combat. There were all-female aviation regiments, sniper units, machine gun battalions. The total number of Soviet women who died in combat during the war is difficult to establish precisely because the casualty recording system did not always differentiate by gender, but historical estimates speak of tens of thousands. Maria Oktyabrskaya is one among those tens of thousands. What makes her different within that group is not the fact of having died in combat, it is the specific combination of elements in her story: the donation of the tank, the name on the hull, the age, the repairs under fire, and the fact that the Soviet apparatus decided to document and disseminate her in a way it did not do with most of the women who fought and died without leaving a trace in the public archives. The mechanism by which some stories survive and others do not, within a conflict of that scale, does not necessarily have to do with the real military impact of the people involved. It has to do with the intersection between what happened and what the documentation and communication system of the moment decided to record and spread. In Maria's case, that intersection was favorable. Her story reached the archives, reached the newspapers, eventually reached the researchers who could reconstruct it. The women who fought alongside her and who died in statistically similar ways, in many cases, did not reach any of those places. That imbalance in historical documentation is not the failure of any individual. It is a structural characteristic of how conflicts on that scale process their own stories, and it is one reason why the stories that did survive, like Maria Oktyabrskaya's, carry additional weight. They represent not only what happened to them, but what happened to many other people whose story did not find the same path into the archives. On January 17th, 1944, when Maria got out of the tank WWII Podruga for the last time to repair it under German fire, the Eastern Front was at a moment of transition. The strategic momentum that in 1941 and 1942 had carried the Germans to the gates of Moscow and Leningrad and to the banks of the Volga at Stalingrad, that momentum was definitively broken. Strategic initiative on the Eastern Front had passed to the Red Army after Kursk. What remained of the war in the East was a German retreat that would still last 16 months and cost millions of additional lives on both sides, but whose final outcome was no longer genuinely uncertain for military analysts observing the whole picture. Maria Oktyabrskaya died on the threshold of that period. She did not live to see the end of the war she had gone to fight. There is a photograph of Maria that circulated during the war and has survived in the archives. It shows her sitting on the hull of the WWII Podruga in military uniform, looking at the camera. The expression on her face is not the heroic expression the Soviet propaganda apparatus usually preferred for its communication materials. It is an expression that is difficult to categorize in a simple way. There is weariness. There is something that could be read as determination or as resignation, depending on what the viewer brings to the image. It is one of the few photographs of someone who knew exactly where she had gone and why, and who had lived long enough in that place to know the difference between what she had imagined before arriving and what it was in reality. On March 2nd, 1944, in a military hospital in Smolensk, Maria Vasilyevna Oktyabrskaya died without regaining full consciousness. She was 45 years old. She had fought on the Eastern Front for less than 4 months. In that time, she took part in enough operations for her regiment commander to recommend her for the Soviet state's highest decoration. The medal arrived 5 months after her death. The tank she bought with everything she had continued, rolling along the front with another driver until damage rendered it useless. The name she chose for that tank, Boevaya Podruga, was painted on the hull when it entered its last battle. If it was still legible when the tank was finally withdrawn from service, no one recorded it. In Smolensk, in the cemetery where she is buried, there is a grave with her name. It is not large. It is not in a prominent place within the cemetery. It lies among thousands of other graves of people who died in the same war, in the same region, under equally extreme circumstances and often equally poorly documented. That is what remained. Subscribe to the channel if you made it this far, and write in the comments the name of a woman from this war that you think we should tell. There are many more stories in those archives. We will continue next week. There is one fact in the Soviet military archives that does not appear in any popular version of Maria Oktyabrskaya's story. A fact that changes the reading of everything above. When Maria sent her letter to the State Defense Committee, she was not the only person in the Soviet Union doing something similar in that period. Between 1942 and 1944, the Soviet state received individual donations for the construction of military equipment from tens of thousands of citizens, families who handed over jewelry, factory collectives that donated wages, farming communities that contributed entire harvests. Popular financing of the war effort was an active policy of the Soviet government, stimulated and organized from above, but carried out with genuine participation from below. What made Maria's letter different was not the donation. It was the condition. In the archives of the State Defense Committee, there are records of other people who donated money for tanks with specific names. There are even records of other women who donated on the condition that the vehicle carry the name of a fallen relative. But the available archives contain no other documented case of a civilian with no prior military experience donating the equivalent cost of a tank with the specific condition of driving it herself in combat. That specificity is what made the letter reach the highest levels of the system, not the emotion of the gesture, the logic of the deal. Maria was not asking for a tribute. She was proposing a contract. That distinction between emotional gesture and transactional proposal is what the bureaucratic officials who initially reviewed the letter did not know how to process. A tribute could be accepted or rejected within normal procedures. A contract with specific conditions required a political decision above their level of authority. That is why the letter went up, and that is why Stalin, or whoever made the decision in his name, approved it. Because within the logic of the Soviet system in 1943, it was a deal that made sense. The state got the money and got a story it could use. Maria got the access she was asking for. Both sides got what they wanted. What neither side could calculate was what Maria was going to do once she was inside the system, because what she did inside the system exceeded what any propaganda calculation could have. Anticipated. The Soviet apparatus expected a symbolic figure who could be photographed next to a tank and quoted in newspapers. What it got was a functional tank driver who got out of the vehicle under fire to repair it with field tools. That distance between what the system expected and what Maria actually did is where the real core of her story lies. The system used her. She used the system too, and inside that mutual exchange of instrumentalization, she did something no one had asked her to do, and no one could have asked her to do because no one could have anticipated it. There is a second fact that the archives reveal, and that the standard narrative consistently silences. The wound Maria received on January 17, 1944, was not the first time she was wounded in a combat operation. The regiment medical records document at least one earlier instance, in December 1943, in which Maria received minor shrapnel wounds during an operation and remained in service without being evacuated to the hospital. That means January 17th was not the first time enemy fire reached her. It was the first time it reached her severely enough that she could not continue. That detail transforms the reading of her behavior. She was not someone operating under the illusion of being invulnerable. She was someone who already knew what it felt like when enemy fire was close enough to do harm, and who had made the decision to continue anyway. There is no documentation of what she thought about it. There are no letters from that period that survived in the archives. What there is the record of her actions, and her actions speak of someone who had evaluated the risk with real information and decided to accept it. Historians who have worked with the period's archives have pointed out that this pattern, remaining in service after minor wounds, without requesting evacuation, was common among Soviet tank crewmen of both sexes during that period. The cultural pressure within combat units discouraged evacuation for wounds that did not completely incapacitate the soldier. That does not make Maria's decision less significant. It makes it more legible as part of a specific human context, rather than as an expression of abstract heroism. There is a third element that the archives reveal about Maria's last days in the Smolensk hospital. The medical records document visits to the hospital by regiment officers during the period when Maria was unconscious or semi-conscious. Among those visits, there is one recorded from Colonel Novikov, the commander who had documented her actions in combat reports and submitted the recommendation for her decoration. There is no record of what Novikov said during that visit, nor of whether Maria had any level of consciousness at that moment. The record only documents the presence, the date, the approximate duration of the visit. But the fact that Novikov went to the hospital is a piece of information the archives preserved without anyone specifically seeking it in order to build a narrative. It is a fact that exists because Soviet military hospitals recorded visits to their patients for administrative reasons that had nothing to do with Maria Oktyabrskaya's later story. That kind of fact, the kind that survives not because someone decided to preserve it, but because it existed within a bureaucratic system that routinely recorded things, is often the most reliable. It has no agenda. It was not selected to prove anything. What it shows, without meaning to show it, is that the relationship between Maria and her regiment's command had developed something the formal reports do not capture precisely. A commander in an active war zone does not visit a hospitalized soldier unless there is a reason that goes beyond administrative matters. Novikov went to the hospital. That is what the archives say. The rest is inference. The fourth hidden fact has to do with what happened to the money afterward. The donation of 50,000 rubles that Maria made to finance the tank was processed by the Soviet state financial system in the same way as all similar donations. It was absorbed into the general arms production budget, and the tank was built within the normal schedules of the Ural factories, which in 1943 were producing T-34S at a rate of several thousand per month. What that means is that the WWII Podruga was not a specially built tank. It was a standard production tank to which a name was painted on the hull and a specific driver was assigned. The vehicle itself was identical to the thousands of other T-34S coming off the same assembly lines in the same weeks. There is something in that detail that says something about the nature of Maria's gesture. The tank was ordinary. What was not ordinary was the person driving it and the conditions under which she drove it. The meaning of the WWII Podruga was not in the metal. It was in what Maria did inside it and around it in the months she had access to it. When the tank was assigned to another driver after her death, it stopped being the WWII Podruga in any sense that mattered. It was once again a standard production T-34 with a name painted on the hull that kept fading with use and the weather of the Eastern Front. There is one last dimension of Maria Oktyabrskaya's story that recent historical analyses have begun to explore, and that popular versions do not address what her story means within the broader context of how societies at war process grief. Maria lost her husband in August 1941. What she did next, the process of selling everything, writing the letter, training, going to the front, can be read in many ways. Official Soviet narrative read it as patriotism. Later, Western narrative often read it as individual heroism. Historians who have worked with the broader context of how Soviet civilians responded to wartime losses have begun to propose an additional reading. What Maria did can also be understood as a specific way of processing grief in a context where individual grief had no recognized social space. The Soviet Union of 1941 and 1942 was a society losing its men at a pace that made individual processing of each loss impossible. There were no collective rituals large enough to contain the scale of death. There was no official language for the pain of war widows, beyond the rhetoric of heroic sacrifice. Maria found an answer to that void that was consistent with the logic of the system she lived in. If the system that took her husband was a system at war, the only response the system recognized as valid was to take part in that war. The donation of the tank and the condition of driving it were, within that logic, the most direct possible translation of private grief into terms the public system could process. That does not mean Maria did not feel what she felt. It means she found a way to act from that feeling that the world she lived in could recognize and answer. On March 2, 1944, that action ended. What did not end is the record it left. The military archives in Moscow, the hospital records in Smolensk, the letters of regiment soldiers that survived in private collections, the photographs that circulated during the war and that are digitized in historical repositories accessible today, and the name painted on the hull of a standard production tank that came out of a Ural factory in 1943 and that kept fading with the mud and cold of the Eastern Front, until someone, at some moment for which no record remains, decided that it was no longer legible or no longer mattered and covered it with another coat of paint, or simply let it disappear. WWII Podruga, fighting girlfriend, the name a 44-year-old woman chose, for the tank she bought with everything she had, and that she drove toward the German lines on the Smolensk front until enemy fire took her out of the seat forever. That is the end of the story the archives allow to be reconstructed. The rest is in the documents that still have not been opened, in the letters that did not survive, in the testimonies of people who died before anyone thought to ask them. Maria Oktyabrskaya died on March 2, 1944. She was 45 years old. She is a hero of the Soviet Union. She is buried in Smolensk. That is what we know for certain. Everything else is the work history still has left to do. Subscribe to the channel. Leave in the comments which part of this story struck you the most. Next week, another woman from this war that the textbooks do not mention.